Hey, what's up? John Beaupre, aka Casino Crime here. Hey, I want to thank you for clicking through the email and checking out today's 10-minute lesson on bankroll management. You know, the games are constantly changing, right? And so should how you manage your bankroll. And I think sort of the old-fashioned, boring way of saying, you know, you need 50 buy-ins to play any given level, you need 100 or 200 buy-ins to play any level, doesn't really work anymore necessarily. So over the past few years, I've learned a lot about bankroll management, and I've learned how to take a little bit of money and invest it wisely in the poker economy and build up a bankroll as fast as possible, risking the least amount as possible. So I wanted to share with you a couple of things that I've learned from both myself and all of my other students. So, you know, if you're a transitioning successful no limit player, or you're somebody who's just starting to play poker, particularly PLO, I think this is going to be a really educational video for you. So thanks again for checking it out. And as always, love to hear your feedback. Email me directly, casinocrime, KASINOKRIME @PLOquickpro.com, or even text message me on my personal phone, 720-260-5005. Good luck, guys. Let me know what you think. Bye. All right. Thank you very much again for joining me for today's what I call the 10-minute bankroll lesson, how to manage your money, minimize risk, and move up in the limits as fast as possible. What I'm going to try doing going forward is every week have kind of like a 10-minute lesson on a topic that a lot of players come to me and ask me about. And today's is, of course, on bankroll management, you know, and managing your money and just overall trying to figure out how to take what we deposit and move up in stakes as fast as possible. You know, whether you're a transitioning no limit player and you've got a healthy roll and you're kind of grinding the mid stakes and wondering what levels to play, you know, while you're learning PLO, or you are a brand new poker player or PLO player and you want to know how much to deposit, what limits to play while you're learning, and how to advance in stakes and build your bankroll as fast as possible, this is going to be for you. You know, I've been waiting to do this lesson for a long time, and I'm excited to do so because I think my philosophy on bankroll management has changed over the years. And, you know, I've found that a lot of the advice on forums is pretty general with regards to bankroll management. And even looking back at some of the material I've made in the past, I think that it was pretty general overall. A lot of people it's almost like people who give finance advice, right? If you're at a party and you ask, you know, somebody says they're in finance and you try to ask them for money advice, typically they're going to give you really conservative advice. They're going to be kind of knitting because they don't want to be the ones responsible for giving you over aggressive money advice. And then, you know, you go misinterpret what they say and go bust your bankroll or make a bad investment based off of them, and they're going to end up feeling guilty. So here what I'm going to do is give you some guilt-free, tried and true ways that I found that are good methods for building a bankroll while risking as little as possible. Which brings me to the next slide, right? Our big, fat, hairy goal is to, of course, move up in stakes as fast as possible, number one. And realistically, you know, people kind of forget what the main goal is, right? Which is to improve our ability to play poker. And I've always looked at it as, you know, not trying to be patient and realizing that making more money and building your bankroll is a gradual process. You want to think of it in terms of the difference between a product goal and a process goal. The product goal is, let's say we want to make $100,000 playing poker, or we want to eventually play professionally. But it's, you know, you'll never get there unless you learn how to actually play poker, right? Or like improve your game, play your A game more consistently, game select wisely, perhaps. So there's a lot of things that you need to think about first before you actually think about your end goal. So I always try to tell my students, you know, it's more important to focus on being a good player, studying the game correctly, and putting in the hours at the table than it is to find the magic bullet that'll, you know, 10 times your roll so that you suddenly move up. Because let's face it, if you suddenly move up, let's say you get like a tourney score and you want to start grinding with your newly found bankroll, you're still going to have to know how to play well. So it's important to like master that before you really worry about having this booming bankroll. And our second biggest goal, of course, is we want to risk as little as possible doing it. One of the most common questions I see on forums and that students write me in about is say, "Hey, man, like I want to deposit 500 or 1,000 or $2,000 playing poker, or into like Poker Stars or something, and I don't want to redeposit. Like I want to make sure that this is actually a good investment of my time, and I don't want to lose my money. And I don't really blame people for that. So those are the two things we're going to focus on today: moving up as fast as possible, and risking as little as possible while doing it. All right, so this is kind of the old school approach I alluded to a second ago, and it's the different buy-in amounts that we need for each level. A lot of players, again, post about this on the forums. They say, hey, how many buy-ins are needed for 50-cent dollar or 25-cent 50-cent? And, this is, for me, I made this list a few years ago, and I think it's still pretty true, that these are the amount of buy-ins that you need to grind at any given stake. Okay, but what we're going to talk a little bit more about in a moment is the difference between actually grinding on a day-to-day basis one of these levels and playing at a variety of different levels, so that you're essentially like using the finance strategy of diversification or asset allocation, however you want to call it, to make sure that we're playing in soft games and we're not just sort of sticking to these requirements. One of the flaws that I see some players make is, again, like let's say we're at a tournament or something, and you're sort of shooting the shit with some other players on break, and you say, "Hey man, like what do you play?" Or like what kind of poker do you play? And they respond, "I'm a 1-2 PLO player. Like I play 1-2 PLO and that's it." And you hear a lot of players do that, right? Where they kind of label themselves as this one stake, one game player, and they don't really branch out. But the better players just say, "Oh, I'm a PLO player. I'm a poker player. Sometimes I play cash games. Sometimes I'll play tournaments." And that's what, that's kind of what I think is the best approach. Is don't just label yourself as one of these players. You're a PLO player. Like how you play or how you're improving or approaching your ability to play should depend little on what stake it is. You should try to play good, regardless of how much money it's for. So, what are the big takeaways from those from the guidelines that I gave you just a moment ago? Well, first being that you saw that there's fewer required buy-ins the lower the stakes are, right? And the reason is because, in general, the more passive games are, and the weaker the opposition is, the less variance you're going to have. So although PLO is in general like a high variance game, there's going to be a lot less variance if you're playing really weak players and they're playing passive. So, especially if you're a skilled player, you don't really need a lot of buy-ins at the lower stakes, because you're going to be playing. There's going to be a lot of weaker players that are going to be making big mistakes, and your decisions won't be quite as thin. Now, as you move up to the higher stakes, games are much more aggressive, right? And again, the more aggressive games are, the more variance you'll have. And likewise, typically just in general, the more all-ins you have, which of course you have at the higher stakes, the more variance there is. So that kind of requires like more required buy-ins to have like a grinding bankroll at the higher limits. So does that mean that if we only have, and I'm going to go back to the other slide here, does that mean that if we only have 40 buy-ins at PLO 200 that we can't take a shot at a PLO 400 game? Remember that question, because we're going to touch on that in just a second. All right, so the new school approach, in my opinion, is the most important question isn't how quickly can I move up in stakes, like when am I allowed to play the next level. What's more important is to ask yourself is how easily can I actually rebuild my role. And this is an important an important point where you should ask yourself, what kind of lifestyle are you looking for? Because let's take a 500 zoom crusher, for example, like somebody who's just destroying PLO 500 zoom. If I were that person, I would be very aggressive with my bankroll, because if you know that you can always drop down and play, 500 zoom and live a pretty damn good life, just on your winnings from that, then you could play pretty aggressively if you're trying to get a very big bankroll so that you can play higher stakes. Of course, it's a lot different if you if you're starting off lower in that way. So the most important question is, how easily can I rebuild my roll when I take shots? And as I mentioned a moment ago, skilled players do have the ability to aggressively shot take because they can drop down and grind. You see it on the forums all the time. I've read a couple of different interviews with guys like Phil Galfond and David Benefield and a lot of the old school crushers. And they all kind of said how lucky they were in the beginning days because they were very aggressive with their bankrolls, and they took some pretty big shots early on in their careers that went well and kind of defined their ability to play bigger later. And one of the reasons they were able to do so was because the games were a lot softer, right? I mean, Galfond was able to, play 300, 600 no limit heads up against even some players who were very good because he knew that he could always, just move back down to like 25, 50, crush there, and then rebuild and then kind of repeat the process. And in that way, he's like kind of free rolling on his profits because he had such a big skill edge because games were still at 25, 50. All things considered, pretty soft back then. So really how aggressive you are with your bankroll depends also on whether you play for a living or not, right? Like if your livelihood, if your lifestyle, the one that you're accustomed to and that makes you happy, is dependent on poker winnings, that's a lot different than someone who is like a David Einhorn or like a Bill Perkins or those big, you see those guys that play the one drop every year. They're billionaires on the side, right? Poker's kind of a hobby for them. They have no problem reloading. Their main source of income isn't coming from tournament winnings, certainly. So, if you're playing for a living and let's say that you're like a 1-2 grinder, you should probably be pretty tight with your bankroll, especially if you're at if you're a new player not completely comfortable with your skill level. But we'll get, even if you're not completely comfortable with your skill level yet, we'll get to it in a moment on how you can improve your game and also like what you should invest your time in to get a big score. All right, so how to build a bankroll. Like if I had to start over, here's the two things that I would do, right? The first is I would find a good rakeback deal and I would start grinding online. And there's a couple of benefits for this. First and mainly, it's that so you can focus on learning and playing your A game consistently. A big benefit of playing online is the volume of hands that you get to see, right? And a lot of players neglect the ability to just play good consistently for a long period of time, which I think is one of the hidden secrets of high stakes players. They maybe they're not like playing their A plus game all the time, but their B game is pretty damn good. Even when they're not really paying attention. Their like default poker game when they're just sort of sitting at the table is pretty damn good. And I noticed that a lot of people who just start the game and people who aren't as experienced, there's a lot of variance between their their A game and their B game, and certainly their C game. So the reason that finding a good rakeback deal is important, especially if you're playing at the micros or the low stakes, is because the rake is just killer at those levels. And in fact, I would say that it's almost impossible to beat the rake at the low levels. And what's nice is that at the low levels, especially if you're just starting out, you're going to be making a lot of mistakes, and it's kind of nice when you have that rake back to fall back on, and it's sort of like the bonus at the end of the week. You get a little bit of money to reward you for the hard work that you've put in, and it gives you more motivation to grind. I mean, if you're not getting any rake back and you're playing for what essentially is pennies at the low and micro stakes, it's not going to be very much fun for very long, and you're just going to quit. At some point, you want to see the fruits of your labor. So I would suggest getting a good rakeback deal, and even if you're playing several tables at the low stakes and you have a good rakeback deal, like for example, I have the ability to find 60 to 65% rakeback deals on almost every site. It actually could be a pretty you can almost make a living on it. So that's not bad. Second, what I would do is I would use the profits and place satellites into big field multis. Now, this is something that was true certainly back in the day, and I think that is still true today. Your best opportunity to get a big score and build your bankroll has to be with the big field live MTTs. If you're starting off at the low stakes, let's say you're playing like 10 cent, 25 cent, 25 cent, 50 cent, or something like that, even 50 cent dollar, it's going to be really difficult to build a 50 or 100K roll playing for amounts that are that small. But as seems to always be the case, like the weakest players, the most recreational players, still to this day love to play poker tournaments. So let's not reinvent the wheel, right? Although the games are getting a little bit tougher in tournaments, it's still a great, it's still a great opportunity to get a score and suddenly have a ton of cash to work on with your own money. And if I'm an online player, that means like satelliting into the Sunday Million or like one of the bigger scoops. Um, if you're a live player, that means satelliting into like a 1K at the World Series or like a local $500, 500K guarantee or something like that. That's your best opportunity to build a roll. Figure out how to build satellites, or I'm sorry, how to play satellites and satellite into those bigger live events. That's what you should really be doing. And at the bottom here, I wrote that something that's key is to avoid staking unless it's absolutely necessary, or you have the opportunity to learn from someone that's better than you. The reason I put that in is because I find that a lot of low stakes players want to leapfrog the whole process of like grinding at the low levels and just, they say, oh, well, I'll just get backed and suddenly I'm playing mid stakes and I'm making mid stakes money. And, I really don't think that's the case. It's rare when you could see someone just suddenly take a low stakes player, transform them into a mid stakes player overnight just because they don't have the money. I mean, again, like the main component of having a strong, stable bankroll is being able to play well consistently for a period of time. So you need to build those skills at the low stakes and be more confident in your fundamental understanding of the game. And although it can be tempting to get staked, I would say try to play on your money, your own bankroll for as long as you can. And, I actually was staked back in the day by a close friend, but the reason that I took staking from him is because it's almost like an apprenticeship, right? Where I wanted to learn from him, and it gave me the ability to play much bigger tournaments and cash games than I otherwise would have been able to. And in that way, it really did advance my game. But the key there was I got to learn from someone who was kind of my poker idol at the time. And I think that if you have the opportunity to do something like that, then that's important. But just like a sheer staking deal, I think in general, if you can avoid it, I would do so. All right, so what should you do now, like with the information that we just learned? Well, the first step I want you to do is identify your grinding game. And, this is this is going to be a game that you've always been able to consistently beat. For me back in the day, the two things that I could always beat were Rush back on Full Tilt. I could always beat Rush. And that was sort of like my staple game, right? Where I knew that no matter what, like if I really needed money, I could always beat Rush on Full Tilt. And number two for me was the live game at the Aria, actually. Live games are pretty soft. Like a 2-5 or 1-2 live game, I just felt like that was very beatable for me. So, back in the day, what I would do to build my bankroll was I would play online during the day when there were no live games running, and then I would go play live at night in the casinos. And it was nice for me because it was pretty stress-free, pretty guaranteed money, and it was a nice way to build my bankroll and then just invest in the great tournaments when they came around, or if a high-stakes cash game came around, or a little bit higher than I was currently playing, then that was a good time for me to take a shot. But having the confidence of knowing that I'll always be able to at least make a living and pay the bills with those two games was important for me. It allowed me to build a lot of confidence. So the second action step is identify your shot-taking game, right? And this is preferably like 1 or 2 levels above your stake. I would say, this would be equivalent to like if you're playing a 1-2 live game, be on the lookout for some great like 5-10 opportunities. And I think that I wrote here 1 or 2 levels above your stake, but I think it's like ideally 2 levels above your stake or even more. Honestly, I think that we're looking for a big boost in our bankroll, something that is going to give us a lot of confidence and be worth playing. I mean, I think for the most part, players bounce back and forth between 2 stakes. But for me, again, like I said, this would be satelliting into a very big like live event or something like that. Something that's clearly soft and that we're plus EV in, that would be a big injection into our bankroll. So I want you to take those 2 action steps just for today. All right, so I want to, again, thank you for watching. And, of course, let me know what you think. Write back to the email that I sent out or post in the comments here. You can always email me at casinocrime, KASINOKRIME, at PLOquickpro.com. And I want to see how you guys like this content, but more importantly, I want to see you use these tips and move up in stakes And if this stuff works, let me know. If it doesn't work, you can let me know too, but this is stuff that I've seen work time and time again with other players, so I'm confident it'll work for you as well. Thanks a lot, guys, and good luck.